And there's the ding dong. Okay, right. We've talked about nematodes divided into two classes. Enoplia, we've talked about, that includes whipworm and trichina worm. Chromadoria is very diverse, and there's a lot of non-parasitic chromadorians. An order within the Chromadoria is the order Rhabditida. There's a lot of free-living nematodes in the Rhabditida, including C. elegans, but there's also three suborders with parasites in them, the Tylenchina, the Rhabditina, and the Spirurina. Now, you got an introduction to the Rhabditina on Monday because I was trying to fill some time, and I ended up talking a bit about hookworm, one that's historically been important in the history of the southern United States. It was a very severe public health problem for a long time. You know, in some areas, it wasn't until the 50s that it started getting under control. I'll come back to the Rhabditina, and you'll see a little bit more about hookworm and then some other species that are of veterinary importance. But I forgot to start with the Tylenchina, which are not as well known because I haven't been able to find any that parasitize vertebrates. They don't parasitize people. They don't parasitize animals of veterinary importance. Most Tylenchina nematodes are either free-living or they're plant parasites. And in the world of plant parasitology, these are very important. They include root knot nematodes, which will literally burrow into plant roots and form big swellings. They're serious parasites of things like soybeans, tomatoes. I think this is where the sting nematode goes that can really do a number on your turf, the kind of thing that, you know, golf course groundskeepers have to worry about. It turns out there are some that are parasites of insects, and they're worth mentioning. There's at least one that's been used as a biological control agent. So if you go into insect parasitology, you might encounter things like this. Okay, just a second. Let me take care of the ding dong. Okay, right, there we go. Okay. In many Tylenchina nematodes have this interesting life cycle where there will be males and females that are often free-living. They may feed on plants. They may feed on fungus. Many of them are fungus feeders. And they will reproduce sexually. And then the females, but typically not the males, will penetrate into insects. They'll just crawl, you know, find a weak spot and crawl right through the insect cuticle, take up residence inside the insect body, and transform into this rather odd stumpy form. The pictures 2A and 4A are the free-living fungus-feeding forms of Thryponema and Atlantonema. Those are the ones on the upper left and the lower left, and they look pretty much like normal nematodes. But then the females penetrate into insects. In Thryponema, I guess there you've got a male and a female that are parasitic, because I can see the one of those drawings under 2B has male parts. But you can see a fully mature female looks kind of like a lump with a big coiled up ovary and uterus inside. And then 4B, I think only the females penetrate into insects, and most of that body is just filled up with uterus and ovaries. So there's this alternation between a parasitic stage where the females produce and lay fertilized eggs, The eggs pass out of the insect body, I think sometimes in feces, and they hatch into males and females that are free living for a time. So these are parasitic on insects, but only at the egg laying stage of life. And there's one of them that's important in Australia and New Zealand, and this is it, Bedingia cericidicola. There's a wasp, genus Cyrex, that is itself a parasite of trees, specifically pines, and was really going through some of the native conifers, the araucarias and things like that in Australia and New Zealand. There was one area where I think they mentioned 90% of the trees were killed by Cyrex in 2 years. And what Cyrex does is it carries around spores of a symbiotic fungus, drills a hole in wood, lays its eggs in the wood, and also lays fungus spores in the wood, and also injects the tree with chemicals that block the tree's immune response. You know, trees don't have white blood cells or anything like that, but they have ways of secreting antifungal chemicals to block a fungus infection. But Cyrex can block those trees' antifungal chemicals with its own chemicals. Cyrex lays its eggs in the wood. The fungus attacks the wood, and then the eggs hatch, and the larvae feed on the wood, on the rotted fungus-infected wood. So this is really cool. You have a wasp that's dependent on a parasitic fungus in order to reproduce. Enter Bedingia cericidicola, which penetrates the wasp and replaces wasp eggs with its own eggs. So what happens is that the wasp lays, the fungal spores in the tree and lays what would be its own eggs, but instead they're nematode eggs. So the larval nematodes hatch and they feed on the decaying wood. The tree, unfortunately, is ultimately killed, but the upshot of the whole thing is that the wasp can't reproduce anymore because the wasp's own eggs have been replaced with nematode eggs. And that has been used very successfully in Australia and New Zealand to counter this introduced, I think it's native to Europe and North Africa, this introduced wood wasp pest, Cyrex. Which is, I mean, that's just so cool. It's got a tail of a tree, a wasp that's a parasite on the tree, a fungus that's a parasite on the tree, and a nematode that's a parasite on the wasp that's a parasite on the tree by taking advantage of the, it's kind of, you start wondering, who is parasitizing whom right here. It gets a little complicated. I love this stuff. Fergusobia, I mentioned just because it's quite strange. It's one of the few organisms known that is a parasite of both a plant and an animal. Over on the left, you've got a female on the far left, and then that's a male kind of in the center. These are native to Australia and India, and they form galls, swellings in plant tissues. You've probably seen oak galls at some point. Anytime you see a leaf with odd bumps on it or anything like that, that's a gall. And males and females form galls in the leaf and the stem buds of species of eucalyptus and syzygium. Eucalyptus you've probably heard of. That's that Australian genus that koalas eat. Syzygium is a tropical genus from Australia, India, and I think Madagascar. The best known Syzygium species is clove. Cloves are dried flower buds of a species of Syzygium. Other species of Syzygium are locally known as things like Malabar plum in India or a brush cherry in Australia, and there's various others. So you might not be familiar with syzygium, but you've at least heard of cloves, I assume. Anyway, males and females form galls. Fertilized females leave the galls and they become parasites of the larvae of certain flies. So left and center, you've got these gall-forming parasites of plants, female and male. And then on the right, that big swollen thing is a fertilized female, and that's all ovary inside. That body cavity is taken up mostly by ovary. Every one of those little dots that you see is a potential, is an egg cell. And I think eggs are laid inside the fly, and when the eggs pass out of the fly, they go on to parasitize leaf and stem buds. So I just thought that was really neat. I'd thought every parasite was either a plant or an animal parasite, but here we've got one that's a parasite of both at different times. And then one of my all-time favorite nematodes is next, Spherularia bombi. Spherularia bombi is a parasite of bumblebees. It penetrates through the cuticle of bumblebees and takes up residence in the body cavity, which in a bumblebee is full of blood. And it turns its uterus inside out, and the uterus grows about 20 times the size of the actual worm. So what you're looking at here, this great big winding bumpy thing, that's an inside-out uterus. And the actual nematode is that little stringy thing down just below center. It's labeled female nematode here. And then the thing has turned its reproductive system inside out, and that has swollen to many times the size of the actual nematode and become an absorptive organ. I think it absorbs nutrients from the blood of the bumblebee. I can't even, this morning I'm just in awe of what I am seeing. Nematodes get up to some pretty horrifying tricks. So Tylenchina, no parasites that I know of vertebrates, many parasites of insects, including at least one that has been used successfully for biological control of an introduced pest species. More species, I think, have been looked at as biocontrol agents. That's the only one I could find that's actively in use. But maybe there's potential there in the future for controlling insect pests. So that's the Tylenchina. Rhabditina are primarily gut and lung parasites of vertebrates, and they don't have intermediate hosts. And these include hookworm, which we talked about on Monday. And hookworm, if you recall, looks like this because the head is hooked. That mouth is perpetually open into a space called the buccal capsule, surrounded by piercing and cutting plates that act like teeth, except I don't think they can open and shut them like a mouth. I think they're permanently fixed in place. And that's Necator americanus, the American hookworm, although I believe it is in fact native to Africa, but it was brought to the Western Hemisphere through the slave trade and became I don't know about South America, but certainly in subtropical North America, became a serious public health problem among Black and white populations alike. And we talked about how it was dealt with. There's a similar species native to Southern Europe, Northern Africa, the Middle East, and all the way to Southeast Asia. This is Ancylostoma duodenale. If you look on the right, that's a male. And if you look at its tail end, down below at the lower right, it's got what look like a pair of fins. That's the male's copulatory bursa. Remember, that's the little pocket that the male has, and he will use those fins, those flaps, to wrap around the female so that he can introduce sperm into her vulva. And in Rhabditina, and certainly in hookworm, the flaps are unusually large. I almost said all nematodes I'm aware of, the males do have that copulatory bursa, but it happens to be really large in Rhabditina, and certainly it's large in hookworm. Ancylostoma consumes more blood per worm than Necator does, 1/4 milliliter a day. Necator americanus consumes a lot less, so you get severe symptoms with fewer worms. And you can also tell the difference by looking at the head. Necator on the left has those smooth-edged buccal plates. Ancylostoma has teeth. I don't know. This would be something. It just struck me. I guess I don't guess we're going to get many trick-or-treaters, but this looks like the kind of thing I could carve on a Halloween pumpkin. Vet people, you might encounter this because there are other species of ancylostoma that infect dogs and cats. On the left is the head of an adult Ancylostoma caninum. That's the dog hookworm. You can see the mouth or the buccal capsule is very similar to the human Ancylostoma duodenale. With those tooth plates. You can really see the teeth there very nicely. And then that's an egg on the right. That's what you would see if you did a fecal mount for dogs. Those dog and cat species can't infect humans, or they can't complete the life cycle. But remember that these eggs hatch into juveniles, and the juveniles infect you by burrowing into your skin. And if you get infected with Ancylostoma caninum, the dog species, the juveniles will crawl through your skin. They can't find their way to your bloodstream, so they'll eventually die there, but not before leaving tunnels in your skin. And you can see those red winding loops right there. That's the track of juveniles of Ancylostoma. The condition's called cutaneous larva migrans. And I can't remember if I've used that word before, but several parasites will do this. Larva migrans is the condition of having a larva crawling through your body. If it stays in your skin, it's cutaneous larva migrans. If it burrows into your organs, it's visceral larva migrans. I think I have talked about visceral larva migrans before, but here's some cutaneous larva migrans for you. The other nasty thing about Ancylostoma, by the way, is that its eggs and juveniles can survive in sand, which Necator is generally not able to do. And so if somebody brings their dog to a beach and the dog takes a poop on the beach, even if the poop later gets cleaned up, eggs can hatch into juveniles that can crawl away and can survive in the sand for several months. And people have been known to get larva migrans from innocently hanging around at a beach. And here's a news story from 2 years ago about a 17-year-old kid who was on a mission trip to South Florida. Here he is getting buried in sand at Pompano Beach. How this was part of the mission purpose, I'm not entirely sure, but I'll let that pass. But in his case, getting buried in sand turned out to be a colossally bad idea because that's what his visceral larval migrans looked like. I'm not entirely sure what the treatment is other than just managing itching and secondary infection. I don't think these things are big enough that you could really operate and eventually your immune system should put an end to them. But I'm sure he spent some very uncomfortable weeks. So be careful about getting buried in sand, and don't walk your dog on the beach. Or if you do, be very good about cleaning it up quickly. Okay, right. There are other strongylids out there that rarely parasitize humans, but you veterinary people might encounter these at some point. Uh, this one, Haemonchus contortus, lives in the fourth stomach of sheep and goats. And distinctive, the gut is filled with blood, so it looks red. The ovaries of the female actually spiral around the blood-filled gut, and you can see why this is sometimes called the barber pole worm. It's got that spiral red and white pattern. So this is something you might see if you go into large animal practice. I'm not sure how common this is in the US. Strongylis vulgaris used to infect almost 100% of horses in the United States. Fortunately, it's susceptible to a group of medicines called ivermectins. I think this is in 2015. A British researcher working in the US and I think a Japanese researcher shared the Nobel Prize for discovering a whole family of drugs produced by a soil bacterium called Streptomyces avermitis. And in that family was a drug called ivermectin, which turns out to be one of the most effective anti-parasite drugs that we've got. Before its discovery, strongylis was extremely common in horses, and the life cycle was very similar to hookworm. Eggs pass into feces, juveniles leave the feces, live free for a little while, but burrow into the horse's skin, presumably if the horse is lying down in the pasture. The larvae travel through the circulatory system and eventually end up in the gut. And S. vulgaris was notorious for causing clots in the mesenteric arteries. Remember, the mesentery is this web of tissues that supports and suspends the intestines. And it's also where the blood supply to your intestines goes. If you clot one of the mesenteric arteries, you're likely to have part of your intestine die. Which is really, really not good. Trying to run around with part of your intestine having died and probably becoming gangrenous. That's very serious. Fortunately, strongylis is susceptible to ivermectin, so that's worked out pretty well. Ostratagia is another one you'll find in more temperate zones. That's the brown stomach worm. This is the lining of I think that might be I guess that's a horse stomach. I'm not sure whose stomach that is, but you can see these whitish nodules on the lining of the stomach, these oval things. Each one of those is a worm that's embedded itself in the stomach lining. Makes it a little difficult to treat simply because, if you pour some medicine down the horse's throat, the ostratagia is insulated from it because it's buried inside the stomach lining. This is one I remember pretty well. When I was a college junior, back in the days when hair metal was still cool. Well, it's always cool, but back when it was new and cool. I spent my junior year at University of Aberdeen in Scotland, and I took zoology there, and we did a whole bunch of labs. There was actually a lot more support staff there than we have here, so we were able to do some things there that I would not be able to do at UCA. What they did was the support staff took a bunch of rats and fed them measured numbers of eggs of Nipostrongylus brasiliensis. And then they killed them, and all we had to do was dissect out the intestines. And when we dissected out the intestines and opened them up, the inside of the intestines were lined with what looked like little pink coils, like somebody had taken little snippets of telephone cord and attached each one by one end to the intestinal wall. And what happened was there's this effect you can see in parasitism where if you have a few parasites, they'll tend to grow large. But if you have a large number in a small space, they will tend to limit their size. So what they'd actually fed these rats carefully measured numbers of Nipostrongylus eggs. And then what we had to do was count the number of viable parasites and measure their size. And we were able to see this crowding effect that you get. I can't really do that here, mostly because I have neither the time, the space, nor the real desire to raise a bunch of rats and parasitize them and then off them. But it was something that stayed with me all my life, and not the actual parasite, just the memory. I didn't actually get parasitized by these guys. But that's an example of how these are used as laboratory models for studies on parasitic nematodes. And they're pretty distinctive, easy to recognize, and you can demonstrate a lot of cool things with them. Dictyocolus is the lungworm. There's a particular rasping cough that sheep, cattle, horses, or donkeys tend to get. It's called husk. And that's some animal's lung. I'm not sure whose. And you can see the worms are present in sizable numbers. And then lungworms in a different family infect not just livestock, but rodents and carnivores. The students I've had in the past that have been working in vets' offices haven't told me they've ever seen these, so I don't think these are particularly common around here. But they are a possibility. There's Oslerus is a parasite, a lung parasite in dogs. Eleurostrongylus infects cats. Metastrongylus infects pigs, and these usually have intermediate hosts. So Metastrongylus is passed on to pigs when they eat infected earthworms, as they're rooting about in the soil. And then last but not least, here's Angiostrongylus, and this one also has that spiral shape caused by a blood-filled gut that's being wrapped around by whitish ovaries. There's that barber pole effect again. And this is normally a parasite of rats, but humans can get it if they eat undercooked intermediate hosts, which can be anything from freshwater shrimp to snails to slugs to frogs. And this is not very common in humans, but if you get it, they'll invade the blood vessels of the meninges, the membranes that wrap around your brain. They've been known to invade the blood vessels of your brain itself. This is called eosinophilic meningitis. Eosinophils, be it said, are a type of white blood cell that tend to be produced in large numbers in response to a parasite infection. So, a doctor ordering a blood count would see large numbers of eosinophils in your blood if you had this. And this is potentially lethal. 3 years ago, there was an outbreak of it in Hawaii that infected 9 people. In this case, it's thought that they were eating contaminated produce. Maybe produce that slugs had crawled over or something like that. I'm not sure of the details in the case. But yeah, a lot of nematode parasites. And I tell you what, I could keep going on and move to the next presentation, but I'm going to go ahead and end this early just because if I keep going at full speed, we're going to come to the end of the course and I'm not going to have anything to talk about. So I'm going to try to pace myself here. So I will go ahead and stop recording.